And it's live.
I can't believe you stole that from me. We just discussed.
Hey man, nothing is sacred.
Just discussed that. I was going to say that. Well, everybody, it is live. Welcome back to the 5th episode of the Morality of Everyday Things. I'm Jacob, one of your co-hosts.
I'm Anthony.
And on this podcast, we consider issues or questions that touch our everyday lives, such as, should you have shared #Blackout Tuesday? Or, in today's episode, why do we segregate sports by sex? Before we begin and dive into this week's episode, we wanted to make a quick request of you, our listeners.
Yeah, we're a new podcast. In case you haven't noticed, this is the 5th episode. We would really appreciate if you could, first of all, let us know any thoughts on the podcast you have to share. Feel free to contact us on Facebook. We've set up a YouTube and an Instagram. Please do give them a follow. It will contain more of the content. And particularly if you're enjoying it, please do give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really, really helps other people find us. And I know that you might think, oh, other people do that, but it is still currently a small community. You'd be doing a really big favor to us if you do actually leave that review.
We'd love to hear your feedback. The whole purpose of this podcast is to promote debate, spark questions, and engage people with interesting moral issues of our time. So
reintroduce nuance into the modern debate.
Exactly. That's our hidden agenda. Not so hidden. So yeah, get involved and give us your comments and your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, bringing it back to the question, why do we segregate sports by sex?
We're using a slightly looser format today. I think the question of sport, whilst it has some philosophy, it tends to be the kind of like haughty academic, like inaccessible philosophy rather than, easy to kind of convey stuff like utilitarianism or Kantianism. So I think it might even be more appealing. Let's do ground up. So
it's true. We looked into a lot of the research around sport, and it's actually
it's
very dry.
Intrinsically defined or extrinsically defined. We're like, no. Let's talk about it from a kind of colloquial perspective. So
exactly.
In order to answer this question, as always, we kind of need to think carefully about the specific parts of the question. So if we're asking why do we segregate sport by sex, firstly, what is sport? I think in the spirit of what we're saying about like not being too academic about it, we can take it to be a general definition of an activity involving physical exertion and skill in which an individual or team competes against another or others for entertainment and to try and win.
Yeah, I think that seems fair. That I think covers most sports that you might reasonably compete in. I suppose what's interesting is the definition does seem to be getting a little bit wider with time. I'm thinking specifically of esports, right?
Yep. I think there's also a whole class of sports where I use the words involving physical exertion and skill. I think there's a class of sports where the extent of the physical exertion is kind of in question.
Snooker.
I think, some people will say darts and snooker sports. Some will say that they're, games. Golf is a good example because it's obviously requires it's physically demanding, but not in the same way that say athletics is, right? It's definitely more on the skill side than physical exertion, but we'll take that kind of general conventional definition.
Yeah, the question isn't so much about what is sport, but with that loose definition, what we want to get onto is why do we segregate sport by sex, which leads us to another question. What is sex?
Oh man, this takes me back.
Say no more.
This is just like when I was 16 all over again. No. In this context, without immature laughing, we'll take it again. Let's take this as a conventional definition. So we'll take it as the biological sex with which you were born. Now, I think the reason why this, immediately people say like, oh, that's not sufficient. I think the reason why this is currently interesting is precisely because we're at a somewhat pivotal moment where this is kind of becoming clear that a conventional definition has limits that are kind of excluding some people or including some people.
I mean, yeah, exactly that. And we'll come to, in a second, the example of Caster Semenya, which gives us the sort of current context and why this question is interesting. But exactly that, DSDs, intersex, trans athletes, all of those challenge our conventional thinking about sex and particularly sex in sports.
Yeah. So Jake, do you want to give us a quick rundown of who Semenya is and why she's in the news last week?
So Caster Semenya is a South African middle distance runner. She's a 2016.
Jake, you're South African. Can you read this in a South African accent?
I think the subject matter might be offensive enough without me. Caster Semenya is a South African middle. No,
It's good. Go for it.
Let's reset. So she's a South African middle distance runner and 2016 Olympic gold medalist. Now, she was assigned female at birth, raised as and still identifies as a woman, but she has XY chromosomes and elevated testosterone levels. She won the 2009 World Championships, but then she was subjected to sex testing, withdrawn from the competition. It was a whole
It was a whole debacle.
yeah. And badly handled, I think
Yeah.
everyone would admit.
Yeah. I think so. So to kind of put it in a quick sentence, because you gave a couple specifics, I think, is it correct then that she falls in the category of DSDs, which stands for differences in sexual development? She fits in a very, very rare class of people who seem to have some traits of each gender don't neatly fit in.
I think, that sounds like as good a summary as I've read. Now, in 2019, new rules came into force preventing women such as Semenya from participating in the 400 meters, 800 meters, and 1500 meter events unless they take medication to lower their testosterone levels below a given threshold that they've defined. And Semenya appealed this, and just last week at the time of recording this podcast, so September 2020, she lost her appeal. Now, the Court of Arbitration, a sport ruling, acknowledged the harm of the testosterone rule to athletes like Semenya, but they said that, quote, such discrimination is a necessary, reasonable, and proportionate means of achieving the legitimate objective of ensuring fair competition in female athletics.
So I think one thing that's just important to clarify is that we in this podcast are big fans of nuance. I think a lot of debate nowadays, kind of as soon as you say like one point on one side or the other, people are trying to like class you. So I think one thing that may be a little bit unfair on this ruling is that you've seen a lot of headlines that basically say like, oh, Semenya's excluded from sport. This is a very specific ruling with very specific limits. And the quote that Jake just gave does clarify that this isn't like with severe contempt that they're doing this. They acknowledge that it is a difficult decision, and we'll kind of talk about both sides later.
Yeah, absolutely. So the ruling specifically, it doesn't set a testosterone limit for all female competitors, just for women with certain DSDs, i.e. those who have XY chromosomes, internal testes and not ovaries, testosterone levels in the typical male range, and whose bodies can respond to that testosterone. It also doesn't set a testosterone limit for women in all events, only to lower their testosterones if they want to compete against women in specific events, so the 400, 800 and 1500 meters. Those are the events, they say, in which testosterone levels and performance, combined with other evidence, suggest clear testosterone-linked advantage.
Yeah. Which is surprising, considering that there are other events where testosterone, both intuitively and I think empirically, is more heavily linked to success. So that would be shot put, javelin, stuff like that. You know, upper body strength focused ones. But the ruling doesn't apply to. So this is a very, very specific ruling that we're talking about.
And it's interesting, like, why those haven't been regulated, or if maybe that's just a question of why not yet.
Yeah. And also, just to clarify as well, again, something that you might misread from the headline, it does not say that Semenya is excluded. It says in order to be included, she has to meet a certain condition, which admittedly is quite an unpleasant one. But it's not strictly saying that she is under all circumstances forbidden from partaking.
Cool. So we've talked a little bit about the case of Semenya. To bring it back to the question, why do we segregate sports by sex? Let's start by looking at the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, that was basically an introduction to a very specific status quo in one circumstance. And I think the point that makes, specifically with reference to the fact that we spoke about, 3 events in athletics, 400, 800, 1500 meter, and that even that ruling by one governing body didn't even apply to all the events that they are managing. I think the really important thing to take away is that status quo really varies by sports. Sports cover an extremely wide array of communities, and they each have their own rules and have had their own history and their own rulings. In some cases, they've introduced segregation, not just by gender, but by lots of categories. So in some sports, for example, bodybuilding and strongman competitions, they actually segregate by natural or untested. Because of legal conditions, it's a little, but the fact that they have a natural one is basically saying this is the one where we make sure no one's taking drugs.
No doping.
Yeah, no doping. We also do weight in some circumstances. So
boxing being a good example, right?
Yes, boxing, weightlifting, Olympic weightlifting, rowing, another one. Which, if you think about it, why does that make more sense than a height limit or height segregation in basketball?
Yeah, it's true. Why does basketball not split into extremely tall and regularly tall categories?
Yeah, the point I'm trying to make there, though, is that the status quo is more likely a reflection of a random mishmash of historical decisions than some indication that the way that things currently are is a reflection of deep philosophical thought from each individual sports governing body. Weightlifting having weight classes, but basketball not having height classes isn't some reflection of the metaphysical difference between lifting weights and throwing balls into hoops. just more a reflection of the history and the people who managed those sports.
And the kind of iterative way in which sports are evolved over time. It's
Yeah.
something just anecdotally as a football fan I always found interesting is when each season they make some sort of minor tweak to the rules, like kickoff at the beginning of the game didn't have to go forwards to someone within the circle. And it kind of changes the look and feel of the sport, but in quite minimal ways. But it's interesting to reflect that sport evolves and changes.
Sport evolves, and importantly, actually, on that point of it's not pointing to a metaphysical difference between some sports. I mean, arguably, we can even take that to the extension that sport is an entirely human construct, such that the sport can arbitrarily change. Like, there's no philosophically perfect way to play football. The way to play football now is as correct as the way to play football in 1970 was. It's whatever the rules are set by FIFA. I'm not saying that's necessarily the 100% correct way to see sport. I'm saying that is a way that I think is most appealing to conventional people. If you disagree, tell me why.
Write to us, get involved. Okay, bringing it back to the question. When we ask, why do we segregate sport by sex? The very framing for that question, why, implies that there is some underlying purpose.
Well, I mean, if there's not, then the answer is like, it doesn't matter.
The answer is it's irrelevant. So I guess a good way to go about answering this question, why do we segregate sports by sex, is to say, well, what is the purpose of sports and to what end does segregation further that purpose?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting example where this very specific, what is the purpose of sport, was actually discussed at length in the US Supreme Court. Jake, do you want to tell us about it?
It's true. This is in the case of the golfer Casey Martin. He was a professional golfer with a bad leg. In all other respects, he was an excellent golfer, but for him to walk around the course would have been painful and difficult. And all he wanted really was permission to use a golf cart to go around the course in tournaments so that he could compete fairly without being in pain. And what's interesting is when he took this to the PGA, the Professional Golfers Association, they said no. He cited the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. And this went to court and some big names in golf testified and they all said, actually, walking the course is an essential aspect of the game. The fatigue factor is important. If you're riding in a golf cart, it's going to give you an unfair advantage. Made it all the way up to the United States Supreme Court and the justices had to decide whether he had a right to a golf cart. And in order to decide the case, they found themselves wrestling with the question, what is the essential nature of golf?
What is the purpose?
Is it just hitting a ball into a hole, or is it also the walking of the course? What is it?
What is it that
makes
matters? golf?
Exactly. So what happened, Dan?
I'm going to make a very long story short. He lost.
No, he won.
Oh, he won.
Yeah.
Oh.
Maybe I should do that.
Yeah, you do.
So the court ruled 7-2 in favor of Casey Martin, and the judge basically said that using a cart wasn't inconsistent with the fundamental character, and he decided that the fundamental character was shot making. Another judge wrote a fairly spirited dissent of that, in which he basically said the very nature of a game is to have no object except amusement. So it's impossible to say that any of a game's arbitrary rules is essential.
To really assess this, you need to assess what the purpose is, and the statement that there is no purpose is, in essence, an assessment of its purpose.
Yeah. So the debate was really, on the one hand, it was about sort of fairness. On the other hand, there was kind of a question of like honor going on here. Basically, golfers felt a little bit sensitive about the athletic status of golf, and they wanted to project the image that it's physically challenging, and this ruling kind of stripped that away. Some controversy.
Yeah, the underlying theme amongst this argument is a question of what is the point of it, because that's how you assess the argument. So let's discuss what are some of the potential points of doing sport.
So we came up with a list of 6. Now they're not necessarily exhaustive, but we feel like these are a pretty good list. Do write to us if you have more or you think we've missed any.
In case you miss it, we're trying to get some engagement here, guys.
I'm going to read out the list and then we'll talk about it. Number 1, personal pleasure, enjoyment. Number 2, health, fitness. Number 3, for moral and social teachings and aspirations. Number 4, to find the very best person at this specific skill or thing. Number 5 is the same, but in a more controlled, categorized setting. So to find the relatively best person. And number 6 is to make money. Sport is the business of public entertainment. So those are 6 reasons, 6 purposes for sport, if you will. Let's talk about them in a little bit more detail.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start with probably the most relatable. Personal pleasure, number 1. For the vast majority of sport, we're not competing at elite level or even competing with an aspiration of competing at an elite level. We're playing for fun. And you could even argue the other way around, that a lot of elite sport, they may enjoy it, but enjoyment isn't a requisite. Is Kipchoge actively enjoying running a sub 2 hour marathon? Is that, I mean, I'm sure
it
he
seems
gets,
unlikely.
yeah, he surely gets some greater sense of, pride and achievement in his
Yeah.
life, but the specific experience is probably not so great.
I can tell you running a 4-hour marathon was particularly unpleasant.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Whereas, in the case of someone like yourself, Jake, who's turning up to play football in a Sunday league, you're giving up your free time, you're net paying to be there.
Oh yeah.
Clearly you're I think it's fair to say you're enjoying the act of,
It's all about having fun. It's all about having fun.
you're having fun.
Sweet.
2, health and fitness. I think this is kind of a funny one, because it's almost like sport is just a sneaky way of tricking people into doing things that are good for them.
It kind of is, in a way. I mean, a lot of sports are literally games. Like, they're
Yeah.
designed to be fun, and it's a great way of getting your fitness in while enjoying yourself. So
I think it's one of the key reasons why a lot of people take issue with, for example, video games being classed as a sport, because it fails to capture this very important element, which is necessarily physical.
And then, yeah, there are some sports that are less on the sort of fun side of the spectrum, depending on what you enjoy. But nevertheless, you go through gym classes and stuff because it's good for you. It's net good for you.
Yeah. 3rd, moral/social teachings, and also to serve as a source of aspiration. I think sports, we've all had this experience where, you're writing your personal statement in your CV, or you're reviewing them if you happen to be in the case where you're hiring people. And people will often point to the fact that they've been involved in team sports as an important part of their social learning, or proof of leadership and stuff. And I think this is actually deeply true, right? Like, playing sports is an important part of our socialization, important part of learning how to interact with others. More often than not, that working as a team is important. Also, important moral learning, or a place to practice our moral learnings. I think it's part of the reason why we teach good sportsmanship, right? The Olympics has, as part of their stated aim, good sportsmanship. There's an excellent quote: "The most important thing in the Olympic Games is not winning, but taking part. The essential thing in life is not conquering, but fighting well."
Yeah, that's a nice quote.
It kind of gives a sense as to why, in a lot of circumstances, we might value the practice of good sportsmanship over necessarily winning. It's why, for those of you who are rugby fans, we may recall that I think a few years ago in the Six Nations, Italy found some flaw in the rules that meant, basically, they'd found a way to exploit the rules so that people weren't allowed to tackle them if they behaved in a certain way. But it was, aside from the fact the rules were obviously changed quickly, people didn't like it because it was obviously unsportsmanlike, even though it was obeying the rules.
It's funny because in some respects, you look at that and you're like, it's a sort of clever, it's almost like a loophole in the rules.
I mean, interpreting the rules well, some could say, is like a part of being a shrewd sportsman, but it seems to be that, maybe to contradict what we were saying before, there is some metaphysical point of this that, even if the rules aren't perfect, sometimes they miss out.
It is interesting because actually that kind of speaks to the spirit of the game point and why sportsmanship is so important, because they're doing something like this and it's sort of seen as sneaky, it's seen as undermining the essence of sport, even though, I mean, it's legitimate, it's within the scope of the rules. But yeah,
it's like
that
laws
sense
in society, right? It's like, it's like how offshoring your cash isn't illegal, but most people are a bit like, it probably should be.
Yeah, it's not within the spirit of capitalism.
Yeah. Well, no, seriously, it's not. Or at least it's not within the spirit of our tax laws.
Certainly, yeah, within paying taxes.
Yeah. So we could argue that, like I said way at the beginning of this ramble, moral, social teaching and providing a kind of source of aspiration for younger people that is respectable, it could be an important purpose within sport.
It's a really important function, especially for like the level of kids and learning.
It might be, for example, part of the reason why we castigate sportsmen who have affairs, despite the fact that that's technically not illegal.
Yeah, they have that sort of public profile, don't they?
Yeah.
And they become good role models. Okay, that was
a long one.
So number 4 was to find the best. And actually, it's funny because I imagine most people, when we made this list, this is probably the thing that most people might think of first when they think of sport, right?
I think in this case, we're talking about finding the absolute best. We'll talk about conditioned best in the next case. And you'll realize that most sports that we're actually familiar with are in some way a conditioned best. But there is also an innate kind of curiosity, like, what is the most that a human being can deadlift? What is the fastest that a human being could run 100 meters? There is that sort of genuine curiosity and a sort of respect that we have. Granted, some of it's genetically arbitrary, but to some extent, we're basically saying a respect for the amount of dedication and hard work it takes to achieve those things, and basically what it means to be the absolute best at something.
It's why someone like Usain Bolt gets as much respect and credit and reward as he does, right?
Despite the fact that he is clearly very genetically gifted,
Yeah.
which may be kind of, you know, morally kind of arbitrary.
And this does bring up an interesting question of meritocracy. Now, we'll come back to that later, but remember that point.
So in that case, we were talking about genuinely the fastest human alive, the biggest deadlift, the, you know, like absolute world records.
The best of the best.
Now, interestingly, when we think about, for example, the Olympics or many professional sports leagues, we're often actually trying to find the best in some sort of relative or controlled way, right? So we'll start to segregate these leagues and control certain conditions. And under those conditions, we're trying to find the best. But why are some controls worth making? I mean, this is the point that we're talking about when we say, why do we segregate by sex, right? I mean, one case that we control in almost all sports is drugs. We generally disallow performance enhancement. It may be argued that this is for safety purposes, but it seems to be at odds with the previous purpose, finding the absolute best at something, because surely if you were the absolute best at something, you'd be even better if you took performance enhancement, right? So by limiting that, we're stopping ourselves from finding the absolute best.
It is interesting because there's no limits involved in like how much training you can do, the kind of diet you can have, but
Or
drugs,
the genetic benefits
or your genetic makeup, exactly. But drugs seems to be, by and large, that's a pretty universal rule across sports, with the exception you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, there are certain sports where that's not the case. So bodybuilding, they have natural and untested categories. Strongman, natural and untested categories. Even they kind of have a farce of the non-natural ones still being tested. But perhaps it messes with the fundamental nature of the sport, or adds an element that people don't want to consider, which is how good are you at sorting out your performance enhancement regime? And then I suppose the other key point is just that it makes it unfair.
It's an interesting thing though, because you're right. When you introduce restrictions in categories like that, it does almost become an element of the sport. Like a big part of boxing is weighing in at just the right level so that you have the maximum sort of power to output ratios.
Exactly. So suddenly managing your diet and your pre-weigh-in cut becomes part of being a good boxer.
Totally. Another thing when we were thinking about this is how do people control and segregate? Skill level is actually another pretty universal way that we segregate. Like, it's just not interesting to have performances where someone is way better than somebody else.
But overall, again, this relates to meritocracy, the fact that we have these controls, or why some are worth making. I think the point is that we're trying to control for factors that make it unfair to compare people. In essence, we're trying to create a situation where there's equality of opportunity, not equality of outcomes.
Exactly, which is why my Sunday League team competes in the Metropolitan London League, not the Premier League.
Not yet.
Not yet.
And then the final point that we mentioned was that, you know, perhaps sports is simply a product that a business is making. There is no fundamental good way to do sports. It's just about what makes sense for the product of that business. I think that kind of mindset is really clearly reflected when you look at, not to generalize, but most American sports and the presentation versus, for example, sports in the UK. I think, for example, when you think of the Super Bowl, people check what the Super Bowl ads were, right? Like
it's almost as big a part of the whole spectacle,
ads and
right?
the Super Bowl halftime show are like half of the event, right?
Exactly.
Whereas in the UK, that is not the case.
Although that's not to say, I mean, sports is still a massive business, and football in Europe is just one of the biggest businesses out there in terms of the flows of money regularly going through it. So sports is, in the elite levels at least, in the business of public entertainment. That's certainly another point. So between all those, we've got 6 purposes, if you like, of why people play sport. Now, how might segregation fit or further those purposes?
Let's start then with personal pleasure. I think this one's pretty intuitive. It's certainly more enjoyable, more competitive, and safer in some cases, particularly in contact sports, when we do segregate sport.
Boxing, right? That's a good example.
Make them fairer matchups. So, you know, you talk about your Sunday league. It probably wouldn't be particularly fun for you if you played a League One side and they beat you 20-0, right?
Yeah.
It would probably feel like a bit of a wasted endeavor. I mean, you might feel flattered that you got to play a League One team, but that's about the only enjoyment you get, right?
Exactly. And in the same way, you know, there's a strong case when you segregate by sex that it is just more enjoyable to compete alongside people who enjoy similar skill levels and talents to you.
And so a women's league makes, of course, intuitive absolute sense. You'd be excluding half the population from enjoying sports. Again, it's not just by gender, like we say, it's why we have leagues.
Now, this does raise one interesting tangent. Why do we segregate in esports?
Yeah, we talked about how men have a physical advantage. That doesn't really explain why we would have separation in sports such as video games, esports. Darts has a women's league, but don't prohibit women from competing in the world
Hmm.
championships. If we're trying to maximize enjoyment, and bearing in mind, like we said, 99.999% of sports isn't elite, it totally makes sense to create a protected class. I think that's also maybe a reflection of patriarchal history, whereby sports was predominantly male in order to encourage the growth of women's sports. You're not going to have many wonder kids suddenly come out of nowhere when you don't create the environment that encourages them to get into the sport, right?
Absolutely. And
So
I think, yeah, that looking at goals 2 and 3, which is a reminder were for people to be healthier and fitter, and for moral teachings and learnings and those
and
purposes that sports
aspirations.
convey.
Yep.
I think inclusivity clearly matters to those as well. That seems to be the essence of the argument why segregation is beneficial, is because inclusivity helps get more people involved.
Yep.
And more people involved, more people do the sport, more people get healthy, or more people are there to learn and to be taught.
And enjoying it. And that's true at an overall level, i.e. sports in general, but also interestingly at an individual sport level. And remember that individual sports are competing with each other, right?
Mm,
There's only so much time that you have to play sports. Whether you choose to play football or handball is to some extent a reflection of which sport is more popular, better. And sports are trying to cater to more people. So it makes sense that they invest, for example, in women's leagues to try and enfranchise, is that a word?
I guess so. The
Yeah.
opposite of
Yeah,
disenfranchised.
to enfranchise more people, to make the sport more popular, bring more people into the base.
And it's women's football provides a wonderful example of that virtuous feedback loop in action. In recent years, a lot more coverage was given to women's football, particularly the World Cups, which meant that more people were watching, which meant that more people get into the sport, which means there's a bigger talent base to choose from when you pick future
Yeah,
teams, which means that there's more investment, more sponsorship. And obviously, the more
true.
exposure you get, the more sponsorship you get. And it does
Yeah.
have this wonderful sort of positive cycle.
Ultimately, more people happy, healthy, and learning moral teachings of football. Well, football sports.
Exactly. So there we can see segregation does seem to confer a lot of benefit to the purposes of sport in those respects. Now, what about on the more elite level? What about when you're trying to pick the best of the
Yeah.
best?
So in that kind of absolute case that we said, I suppose segregation is irrelevant, right? Like
I think so.
if we're trying to find literally the strongest person possible, the fastest person possible, it's a singular spot, right? Segregating it so that you have the best under this control and the best under this control and the best under this control doesn't really matter.
If anything, it's possibly negative because you imagine that a competition that brings together the very best of the best is also what pushes people to be the very best that they can become.
Actually, to reflect on what we said before, though, perhaps considering again that sports are competitive, you could argue that being inclusive can get more people to play a sport, makes it more likely that the very best focus on building the specific attribute, maybe.
Mm.
But I'd say overall, yeah, it's somewhat irrelevant, right?
However, what about the case where you're trying to find the best within specific categories? Well, that is literally segregation in action. Segregation is furthering the cause because it is literally the very process by which
Yeah.
you are determining who is the best within categories.
Well, it's also it's interesting, right? Because I think if you were just looking for the absolute, as in like the fastest person possible, like what is the fastest time that someone can run 100 meters, what is the most that someone can deadlift, it does take away a lot from the sport, right? It means basically anyone other than someone with the perfect genetic makeup may as well not compete.
Mm.
And really, as we were saying, there's a positive part of meritocracy where we want a equality of opportunity. There's many amazing female athletes who would basically be robbed the opportunity to even partake just by fact of being born a woman, if the only point of sport. And to clarify, these are six purposes that it could be a little bit of several of them, right?
Hmm.
But if the only point was simply just to find, in absolute terms, the best at something, then we would be stuck. I think another point actually is that we focused on the physical exertion part in the best. Perhaps there's also an element of the best in skill-based or more subjective sports. So, for example, dancing.
In the case of that goal, to find the best within categories, the one lingering question is what is worth controlling for? And ultimately, I suppose that's up to the sporting bodies to decide
Yeah.
where they draw the lines. Now, the final goal was that sport is a business and it's in the business of entertainment and generating revenue. And I suppose it's kind of hard to make the case that segregation helps that, except that by segregating, there are more events to cover and potentially more merchandise. And maybe there's the whole aspirational point so that draws more people in, future investment, you get the positive feedback cycle. So
Yeah.
actually on balance, maybe segregation does help that.
Interesting. So I think there's two terms competing with each other, I think, to some extent. It was the questions of inclusivity and fair meritocracy, right? So
Mm,
like, how do we include people? It seems that a lot of purposes find inclusivity to be very important, but at the same time, how do we make it fair to compete? And different purposes, if we have different conceptions of the purpose of sport, to different extents are these important, right? So
yeah.
if it's about finding the best, inclusivity is less important. If it's about people having fun, moral teaching, potentially business, health and fitness, inclusivity is of paramount importance. Sport would be a failed endeavor if only one person did it, but they did it extremely well.
Yeah, you'd miss out on a lot of the moral teaching and a
Yeah,
lot of the fun, frankly.
cool. So on the topic of inclusivity, it takes us to the difficult question that we started with.
Yeah, it brings us back to the topic of Semenya and other athletes that fall into similarly sort of grey area in terms of categorization by sex.
Well, in the perspective of committees, not necessarily in their own perspectives. In their own
Yeah,
perspectives, there isn't a grey area.
yeah, sorry. There's a guy called Ashwandon who put it this way. When we're trying to determine how to segregate people, it's a trolley problem. And World Athletics and anyone who cares about Semenya and track and field, they have to acknowledge that no matter what decision gets made, someone is going to get run over. In other words, it's a zero-sum decision.
Someone has to lose.
There are going to be winners and losers.
Specific to this issue, I suppose the principle is important, but one thing that's worth considering is the extent to which this happens, right?
The practicalities.
Yeah. I mean, if there was some assurance that this would literally be one person ever, would it be worth causing a huge row over rather than just allowing them to compete? And then on the flip side, if it's only one person, is it worth disenfranchising a lot of women or upsetting a lot of women just to allow one person the opportunity to compete? It's sad, but if an athlete gets hit by a car, that's tragic, and it also removes them from the ability to compete.
I think in the case of Semenya, what makes it tragic is really the way that it was handled and the way that it played out.
I think it's without any sort of argument that they handled it in a fairly disgraceful way. It was basically, she was not told that she was being tested for her sex, and then it became public knowledge, which obviously is quite a humiliating way to deal with that interaction with the governing body. So the question at hand is not whether they handled it correctly. I think they didn't.
But it's the question is, how should it be handled going forward?
So Jake, one justification that people give for Semenya competing as a woman is that she was born and raised female and identifies as female. So to not allow her to compete is to reinforce harmful gender norms. So if you're not womanly enough, should you not be considered a woman? Which I think it's fair to say is somewhat corrosive. And also that it might undermine her personal identity, right?
I can see that. I can completely see both points. And I think there is a risk going forward that more quote unquote manly women will be persecuted. Persecuted is a good word.
Yeah.
Persecuted.
Yeah.
I suppose the only counter you can make to that is just that ultimately someone's got to decide the rules. If women's sport is to be a protected category, where do you draw the line in terms of who classes as women? And here, what they've done is they've taken testosterone levels, right? That's what they've gone from. They've said that is the determining factor, and that's ultimately their decision as the governing body of the sport. But
I think it's interesting as well. There's to some extent an analogy with citizenship. Different sports have different criteria for determining citizenship. In some cases, you need to literally be a local citizen, have lived there a certain time, have family there to avoid people just giving a passport so you can play for them. And it kind of gives rise to an interesting an analogical thought experiment. What if you wanted to represent a country? Take me as an example. I'm of Greek origin. Well, I believe I'm of Greek origin, and I'm raised to be of Greek origin. But I'm in the UK, but that's my ancestry, and the rules seem to allow that. If there were to be some sort of investigation that determined that actually, whilst I identify that way, we discovered that my grandfather lied, was actually from a neighboring country and bought a fake passport.
So Constantine Collius was never actually Greek.
No, exactly. Like say this was the case. Would that then mean that I should be permitted to compete for Greece, or does that mean that I should follow the conventional rules and, despite the way that I identify, not be allowed to compete?
So in this thought experiment, what we're saying is that facts come to light. You're not Greek in any way that qualifies you to represent them. Should you still be allowed to just because you identify culturally as Greek?
Would the fact that it upsets me change the fact that we've revealed that there is some sort of murky grey area? And it is a grey area because obviously if I were visiting Greece a lot, speaking a bit of Greek, what the question of what it is to be Greek in a general sense is different to how does this governing body define whether you're Greek.
And ultimately, I think that's what it comes back to, is the governing body will have their regulations. And your case may prove to be a challenge to the way that they've stipulated that. But they've set that up in a way so as to level the playing field. And
God, it's just
tough, isn't it? It's very tough.
It's upsetting to kind of think about, right? Because Like you said earlier, there's just no winning.
I guess the general takeaway here is that categorization is always somewhat arbitrary, and our aim as well, the aim of governing committees at least, should be to try and do it in the least imperfect way possible, and bit by bit kind of get to a point where everyone does feel as included as possible.
Oh man,
tricky times.
So do you have a view on the Semenya ruling?
I don't really, and I think it's tough because it's so colored by the events that she went through, and I think obviously that makes things trickier. I don't know enough scientifically to make the decision. I suppose you have to trust to the fact that someone has assessed it scientifically and decided that the thresholds they've set make it fairer for the class of women's sports. And
fair.
But it's but
you use the word fair there, so that takes us to the next theme that we discussed a lot: meritocracy.
Indeed. So meritocracy rewards hard work and talent. Possibly it's the talent word there that's kind of key, right? You may remember, if you've listened to our episode on billionaires, quick plug for episode 1, Should Billionaires Exist?, that we spoke about a philosopher, John Rawls, and he took issue with the whole concept of meritocracy, which is quite fun because actually, if you look around, meritocracy is kind of baked into the way that capitalist societies function, especially in America.
It means it's deeply culturally and psychologically ingrained.
But Rawls thought that meritocracy was ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, basically, his argument is that on some level, everything is morally arbitrarily inherited. Does it matter more whether I have intelligent genes or, the ability to work hard and succeed is largely determined by how intelligent you are, how hardworking your nature is, how conscientious your nature is. And if you do not have those things, that means that you are not a worthwhile person. Like, what's supposed to be the takeaway from that? And I think that the point or the relation here is, why are certain genetic differences being punished whilst others are arbitrarily being celebrated?
So here's a good question for you. Take Michael Phelps, for an example. The guy he's a very talented freak.
Let me clarify what we mean by freak, though. Sorry, just
he has genes that confer tremendous advantage on his ability to swim.
If I remember correctly, abnormally large hands and feet, double jointed ankles, so he gets a larger range of motion from kicking with them. His arm span is completely disproportionate.
Interesting.
So why is that a genetic trait that we're essentially celebrating, whilst Semenya's is one that we're punishing?
And it's interesting because the point we're trying to get at there is,
it's not a result of their moral agency.
Yeah, they were born that way, and yet Phelps is celebrated as, probably he will go down history as one of the best swimmers ever. Semenya was awarded golds in the Olympics, but she's been really penalized by these rulings that say actually she's not eligible to compete in the categories that she was competing in.
I think one reason why these might be unfair comparisons is just thinking about how it's segregated and why we have a protected class for women. So in the case of Phelps, I mean, essentially, if you segregated him, where else would he compete? He would not have a place to compete.
How would you even segregate him?
Yeah.
Like by foot size or something?
Yeah.
I mean, what would you...
And even then, like, say that you did that, you'd probably segregate in a way that takes a lot of the other top swimmers. And then basically it would remain that those are the quote unquote best swimmers. And then whoever is not in that class you'd create a new winner of another class, but otherwise the outcome is much the same. That is assuming that you segregate in a way that he can either in some way remedy it. And there's no surgery. You get to shorten his arms, right?
No, not one that he'd want anyway.
No, but in essence, he would either have the opportunity to compete entirely removed, or we'd create a second league,
basically an elite class.
Yeah, we'd basically just be creating an elite class. In the case of Semenya, whilst arguably it's very unfair, she does have the option of reducing her testosterone, which we can say could be very harmful to her, but it's often the case in many sports that we have status quo where we encourage people to do things that are very harmful to them in the interest of being better at the sport, right? So, for example, in the case of the untested bodybuilding and strongman competitions, we're basically encouraging people to take performance enhancers. I suppose that's why most sports don't do that. But also in, say, for example, horse racing, boxing, any weight class sport, we're encouraging aggressive dieting strategies to try and meet weight class limits, right? And doing that well becomes part of doing the sport well. In the case of horse racing, where they're doing big sauna sessions to try and get as light as possible before the race. It's not unheard of to require people to do things that are actually arguably maybe not great for their health in order to partake in sport.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't blame her for not wanting to.
An alternative, she is eligible to compete in the men's, I would suppose. Is that true?
I believe so.
I don't know. But obviously, it's, part of the reason it's not discussed is because she wouldn't be able to compete at an elite level. But there's a difference between saying you couldn't compete at the elite level because you're not able to, and saying you're not permitted to compete.
Yeah, that's true. What you're saying there is that she's still eligible to. It's just that then it's a question of can she perform at that level, which kind of puts her in the same position as a lot of men who are better than the best women, but not as good as the best men in athletics specifically.
Yeah. Wow. Oh man, it's tough.
So on balance, is sex segregation in sporting competition morally justifiable? And ultimately, who should decide?
Yeah, I think it's generally morally justifiable. I think it's more often than not in keeping with the purpose of the sports, because again, reminder, 99.999% of sports.
I'm not sure about all those nines there, mate.
Yeah, I know. Is competed at like a non-competitive, non-elite level. The moral social teaching, the health and fitness benefits, the enjoyment of the sport are probably the primary purposes there, right? And segregation is helpful both amongst sexes, but also amongst weight classes and stuff for safety or fun, competitiveness, and leagues, right? The more difficult question is, how do we deal with people who don't neatly fit into categories?
And ultimately, the question of who should decide is that it is the responsibility of the sporting committees and leagues, probably, where we don't agree with them. I suppose it's the responsibility of participants and interested people to take issue with that and try and take action.
I think the reality either way is that what's going to happen is that it's going to be a case-by-case basis, right? It's every single committee where they determine that there is an athlete that poses this question, there will have to be some sort of appeal or some sort of argument over it.
It's like we said, it's a trolley problem, isn't it? It's a zero-sum thing. There's going to be someone's going to lose. Given the committees are the ones driving the trolley, you want to make sure that they're going very carefully along the tracks. I think on balance, my view is definitely that having considered it, there's a lot of argument in favor of why we segregate on the basis of sex in sport and on the basis of other categories too. And it makes for a fairer, more interesting playing field, which promotes so many other virtues.
Although, sorry, I meant to say that does rest on the assumption, that a lot of people make, that inclusion of difficult to categorize individuals undermines. A lot of people will say is a big assumption. The evidence isn't clear enough to be definitive, I think. I'm being careful with my words. I don't know what the answer is. Please don't hate me.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Jesus, that was a long and difficult one.
This was a tricky episode. I think in prior episodes, we've come into an argument with a clear idea of our position, and it's been really interesting to research it and kind of try and balance that out against other opinions. But this was genuinely just a difficult topic, and I feel like one of the great things about doing this is I feel like I've learned a lot by doing this. But next week we need to go for something lighter, like abortion or something.
Well, I think that's pretty much everything. Jake, what do you think we'll chat about next episode?
We've got a number of potential topics, things that we'd like to get into. Tell you what, if you guys want to hear one in particular, I mean, we'll cover all of them eventually, but we were looking at the morality around vegetarianism / veganism. Climate change is a potential topic we can come to.
I have one that I wanted to discuss was, is it wrong to work at Facebook?
That's going to be a very relevant topic as we come up to the US elections. Yeah. Oh my God, that's going to be big.
We will call that a day. It's been great to chat to you all. Have a good day. Please leave that review on Apple Podcasts.
Yep, like, subscribe, and take care. Thank you very much, everyone.